The death of the two soldiers cast a pall over Parliament, but after condolences, question time turned again to the carbon tax. The government's climate change advisor, Professor Ross Garnaut, handed in his final report today, and I'll be speaking with him shortly. But the day began with calls for an end to the live cattle exports after disturbing images of Indonesian slaughterhouses aired on Four Corners.
The Minister for Agriculture needs to act immediately.
From early in the morning, many voices were publicly raised demanding an end to live cattle exports and threatening action.
If what we saw last night was occurring in Australia, those responsible would be arrested.
It was even more dramatic behind closed doors. A timid Labor caucus that's rarely questioned its leadership in 4 years rebelled. 20 speakers called for action and threatened a caucus motion to force the executive's hand. Then MPs lined up with activists to ensure their objection was visible. And the minister responsible got the message.
Was the decision made to suspend trade made after caucus?
It was made, well, there's a range of options available to me. I undertook to, obviously I went to caucus to find the views of caucus. I think it's important that I do share this issue with caucus. During caucus, I come to the conclusion that there was an important issue to move to suspend.
Joe Ludwig has suspended exports to 11 slaughterhouses and might extend that to others. His department's now investigating the trade, and an independent review will examine the entire supply chain to the point of slaughter, and there'll be a moratorium on the use of a type of restraint box used in live export.
Here's my report.
With the climate change advisor Ross Garnaut handing in his final report, the other issue was climate change.
Australian households will ultimately bear the full cost of a carbon price.
And that's why we will use the majority of the revenue raised from pricing carbon to assist Australian households with those impacts.
Today, Tony Abbott bowed to pressure and supported the government's push for the plain packaging of cigarettes. But he got little credit for it.
It was against his instincts are to say no.
And the Speaker's job was briefly in jeopardy when the chamber voted against one of his rulings. History called for a resignation.
And after question time, I will be taking the time to consider my position.
But this rowdy, divided House finally agreed on one thing.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to move that this House has confidence in your speakership.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for moving this motion, and I am very pleased to second it.
A short time ago, I spoke with the government's chief climate change advisor. Professor Ross Garnaut, welcome.
Hello, Chris.
What should the starting price of the carbon tax be?
My recommendation is $20 to $30, and I focus especially on the midpoints of that range.
Around about $26 a tonne, and what would that raise?
About $11.5 billion in the first year, rising a bit over time over the first decade.
And how should that money be spent?
The largest commitment should be on tax cuts and other compensation for lower middle income earners, because they will end up paying most of the increase. A large part of the carbon price will be passed on by the companies who initially pay it, passed on to ordinary households, and so the larger part should go in tax cuts, and those who can't be compensated by tax cuts, like beneficiaries and pensioners, should be fully compensated through the social security system.
So just to be perfectly clear about that, even though the government says it's the 1,000 biggest polluters that will be charged, it will end up in the wallets and purses of Australians?
Yes, not 100%, but a high proportion of them. For example, on average, the electricity generators will pass on to households the carbon price that they have to pay.
Should exporters who are trade exposed also get some sort of compensation?
Yes, and I've suggested as a transitional arrangement that a modified version, something like what was proposed for the CPRS, be introduced. That's the Rudd government's proposal. But I'm suggesting that from 3 years we should go on to an economically calculated, disciplined approach to give an economically appropriate level of assistance.
So they shouldn't just be compensated forever. That should change over time.
Yeah, and it should take into account what others are doing. If you simply paid back to export enterprises all the carbon price they pay, and others are doing things, you're actually subsidising them. And especially in the case of the resource exports during a resources boom, if you artificially increase incentives to their production and investment, you actually reduce the number of jobs in the rest of the economy.
Should the electricity generators be compensated at all?
No, I don't think so, because they will on average be passing on the electricity increases. They've known about this adjustment for a long time. I think you do have to keep an eye on what's necessary for energy security, but that's not a question of compensation. That's a question of keeping an eye on a number of specific matters related to debt and security of operations.
What if some of those companies were to go into receivership because of the carbon tax?
Well, under my recommendations, there are protections against that in the form of loans where necessary, or government guarantees of loans. But it's not likely that they would go into receivership, but I've made some recommendations that cover the circumstances that would arise should they do so.
Isn't there another report which the government hasn't yet published, which is the Morgan Stanley report, which did suggest that there was some threat to energy security because of the carbon tax?
Well, I'm not free to talk about Morgan Stanley report because it was secret, except to say that that wasn't the sort of rigorous analysis that would influence economically literate people.
Should petrol be included in the tax?
What I've suggested that it be included, that the first impact of the petrol be offset by a reduction in excise, and that in turn
so petrol prices would fall at first?
No, that would be the reduction in excise on day one will be equal to the carbon price on day one, but it's included in the...
So it would be neutral?
Day one it's neutral. Over time, I would suggest that other mechanisms be found to compensate for the increases over time in the carbon tax. Most importantly, tax cuts. I think there's room for large tax cuts a few years down the track.
Now, you were saying today, of course, that there will be new jobs because of this, as there was when tariffs fell across the 1980s and 1990s. Yeah. But some areas of Australia will be disproportionately affected, won't they?
Yes, that's a possibility. And I said today in answer to a question that the most likely area that might be disproportionately affected would be the brown coal electricity areas of Australia, especially the Latrobe Valley. Now, that's not certain because that region would have a very different future if carbon capture and storage, the capture of carbon and storage underground were successful. In fact, if that were commercially viable, then that might be an expanding region, and that region has very great possibilities for that. But if that doesn't work, then there will be reduction of employment, and you need some structural adjustment assistance to help the adjustment.
Okay, once the carbon price comes in, should all other green schemes end?
I'm proposing that there should be a large commitment of revenue for what I call innovation, for people doing new things, investing in research, development, demonstration and commercialisation of new technology. So there's a continuing role for that. But of the existing expensive schemes, like the rooftop solar and the renewable energy target, I would propose phasing those out, and I've got suggestions for that in the paper, of course consistent with honouring clear contractual commitments.
The International Energy Agency has said that the world's carbon footprint is actually growing. It grew last year. That must disappoint you.
Not as much as it might have disappointed the International Energy Agency, because my expectations of business as usual emissions have been higher than the International Energy Agency. When my report came out, my business as usual expectations were considerably higher than that agency. They've since upgraded theirs, raised theirs, so they're a bit closer now. But yes, we're not doing enough, and unless the world with us as part of the world, takes stronger action than we're taking right now, then we're going to end up with dangerous climate change.
Professor Garnaut, thank you.
Good to talk to you, Chris.